He had been king for 7 years. In that time, not a single person had told him the truth. Not once. Not about anything that mattered. They told him his decisions were wise when they were reckless. They told him his speeches were stirring when they were hollow. They told him he looked well when he hadn't slept in 3 days, and they told him the kingdom was prospering when children in the outer provinces were eating bark soup to survive the winter. And every 6 months, like clockwork, his council paraded another round of women through the great hall. Daughters of lords, nieces of generals, sisters of territorial governors, each one more beautiful than the last, each one wearing the same practiced smile, each one saying the words they had been coached to say since childhood. "It would be an honor, Your Majesty. I live to serve the crown, Your Majesty. Whatever you desire, Your Majesty." He had stopped listening years ago. Demon Cross sat on the throne of black stone and silver and watched the latest offering, Lady Portia of the Eastern Valley, curtsy before him with mechanical grace. She was beautiful, dark hair, green eyes, a dress of emerald silk that probably cost more than most families in his kingdom earned in a year. "My father sends his regards, Your Majesty," she said, her voice a perfect melody of deference and invitation. "And his hope that an alliance between our houses might bring prosperity to both." Prosperity. That was the word they always used. What they meant was power. What they meant was access. What they meant was, "My family wants to stand closer to the throne, and my daughter is the price we are willing to pay." "Thank you, Lady Portia," Demon said. His voice was flat. "You may go." She blinked. The practiced smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, curtsied again, and retreated. Her father, Lord Ashmore, standing among the courtiers, turned a shade of red that clashed violently with his ceremonial robes. The hall emptied slowly. The courtiers filed out in clusters of whispered outrage and political recalculation. Another rejection, the 7th, this year. The Alpha King was impossible. The Alpha King was broken. The Alpha King would die without an heir, and the kingdom would fracture, and it would be entirely his fault. Demon didn't care. When the last footsteps faded and the great doors closed with a sound like a tomb ceiling, he sat alone in the empty hall and stared at the banners overhead, crimson and gold, the colors of his house. The colors he had inherited, along with a crown he had never wanted, and a throne that felt less like a seat of power and more like a cage made of stone. His chief advisor, Lord Mercer, appeared at his side. The man moved like smoke, gray-haired, thin-lipped, perpetually composed. He had served Demon's father before him and carried the particular air of a man who believed he was the only competent person in any room. "That was the 3rd daughter of a major house you've dismissed this season," Mercer said. "Not a question, an accounting." "I'm aware. The council is losing patience." "The council can lose whatever it likes." "Your Majesty," Mercer's voice tightened by 1 precise degree. "You are 28 years old. You have no mate, no heir, no alliance secured through marriage. The northern provinces are restless. The border lords are whispering about succession. If you do not choose..." "Choose what?" Demon turned his head. His pale gray eyes, the color of a winter sky before snow, settled on Mercer with the quiet, heavy focus that made most men look away. Mercer, to his credit, held the gaze. Barely. "Choose which lord's daughter has been trained to lie to me most convincingly? Choose which political faction gets to plant a spy in my bed?" "Choose stability," Mercer said carefully. "None of them are real." Demon said it quietly, almost to himself. "Not one. I've met 43 women in 3 years, Mercer. 43. And every single one looked at this." He touched the silver circlet on his brow. "And decided who I was before I opened my mouth. They don't see me. They see a crown with a man attached to it. Mercer was silent for a moment. Perhaps, he said, that is the nature of being king. Then the nature of being king is loneliness dressed in silk and called duty. Demon rose from the throne. He was tall, taller than most men, broad through the shoulders and chest in a way that spoke of years of combat training rather than mere inheritance. He moved with the controlled economy of someone who understood exactly how much damage his body could inflict and had long ago learned to keep that knowledge leashed. "I'm leaving the capital," he said. Mercer's composure cracked, a hairline fracture quickly sealed. "Leaving?" "For 2 weeks, perhaps 3. "Might I ask where?" "No." "Might I ask why?" Demon stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. "Because I want to know if there is a single person in this kingdom who would offer a stranger a glass of water without first checking whether he was wearing a crown." He left before Mercer could answer. He prepared in silence, alone, in his chambers, with the door locked and the guards dismissed. The room was vast, dark wood, tall windows, bookshelves lining the walls. But tonight it felt like the inside of a coffin. He stripped off the black coat with the Valdris crest, removed the silver bands from his wrists, took the circlet from his brow and held it for a moment, turning it in the firelight. A thin ring of hammered silver worth more than most villages. He set it down on the desk with a soft click that sounded like a lock opening. From the back of his wardrobe, he pulled clothes he hadn't worn in years. A rough-spun linen shirt, a leather vest, cracked and faded, trousers patched at the knee, a traveling cloak of dark brown wool, fraying at the edges, boots that had seen better decades. He dressed slowly, looked at himself in the mirror. The man who stared back was unrecognizable. Without the black coat and the silver and the weight of ceremony, he looked like what he was underneath all of it. A tired man in his late 20s, with dark hair and gray eyes and a jaw that hadn't unclenched in 7 years. Nobody. A traveler. A stranger passing through. He reached for one last thing. His father's ring, a band of dark iron stamped with the Valdris wolf, and threaded it onto a leather cord, tucking it beneath his shirt, where it rested cold against his sternum. Insurance. Proof of identity if everything went wrong. He climbed out through the window of his own castle like a thief. The irony was not lost on him. The first city was called Ashford, a market town, prosperous enough, 3 days' ride from the capital. Demon arrived on foot, dusty and road-worn, and walked through the gates like any other traveler. The difference was immediate. No one bowed. No one stepped aside. No one lowered their gaze or pressed themselves against the wall to make room. People looked through him the way they looked through furniture, registering his existence and immediately discarding it as irrelevant. He walked into the largest tavern on the main square. The room was warm, crowded, loud with laughter and the clatter of cups. He found a seat at the bar and waited, and waited. The barkeeper served 3 people who arrived after him before finally acknowledging his existence with a flat, disinterested glance. "What do you want?" "A meal and a room for the night." "I can pay." Demon set 2 copper coins on the counter, the going rate for basic lodging in any town this size. He'd checked before leaving. The barkeeper looked at the coins, looked at Demon's clothes, looked at the coins again. "Room's 4 coppers. The sign outside says 2. Sign's old. Price went up." It hadn't. Demon could see it in the man's eyes, the quick calculation of a predator spotting easy prey. A stranger with no connections, no friends in town, no one to complain to. Easy to overcharge, easy to cheat. He paid the 4 coppers. The meal that arrived was thin soup with something floating in it that might once have been a vegetable. The bread was 3 days stale. The room upstairs was a closet with a straw mattress and a window that didn't close. He lay on the mattress in the dark and listened to the sounds of the town through the broken window. Laughter from the tavern below, a dog barking. Somewhere distant, a woman singing her child to sleep. This was his kingdom. These were his people. And they had just charged a stranger double for a bowl of water with a potato in it. The second city was worse. Demon spent the night in a barn on the outskirts. The farmer had offered it grudgingly in exchange for chopping firewood, which Demon did for 3 hours until his palms blistered. The straw was damp. The roof leaked. Somewhere around midnight, he woke to find his traveling pack open and his remaining coins gone. The farmer's son, most likely. Or the farmhand who had watched him count his money with a little too much interest. He left at dawn with empty pockets and a new understanding of what his kingdom looked like from the bottom. The third city, a larger town called Bryn's Crossing. Demon had developed a cough on the road, 2 nights sleeping in the cold, and stopped at an apothecary to buy something for it. The apothecary was a round man with small eyes and clean hands that had clearly never done hard labor. He looked at Demon's clothes and quoted a price that was 5 times the standard rate for a basic cough remedy. "That seems high," Demon said carefully. "Supply and demand," the apothecary said, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Good medicine costs good money. If you can't afford it, there's a ditch outside where the beggars sleep. Fresh air is free." Demon bought nothing. He stood outside the shop for a long moment, his cough rattling in his chest, and thought about how many sick people in his kingdom had stood in this exact spot and made this exact calculation: medicine or food, healing or survival. He had signed tax reforms from his throne. He had approved medical funding proposals with a stroke of his pen, and none of it, not one document, not one decree, had changed the look on that apothecary's face. The fourth city. Demon sat on a stone wall near the market square eating a piece of bread he'd earned carrying crates for a merchant. The first honest transaction he'd had in 8 days. When he saw them, 2 city guards. Big men, armed, wearing the crest of the local lord. They had a man by the collar, old, thin, white-haired, struggling weakly, a vendor. His cart of apples had tipped, spilling fruit across the cobblestones, and the guards were shouting about a tax he hadn't paid, a fine he couldn't afford. One guard hit the old man across the face, open-handed but hard enough to split his lip. The market square was full of people, dozens of them, close enough to see, close enough to hear. Not one person moved. Not one person spoke. They looked away. They walked faster. They developed a sudden intense interest in whatever was directly in front of them. And the old man bled on the cobblestones while his apples rolled into the gutter. Demon stood up. The guards saw him coming and squared their shoulders with the automatic aggression of men who were used to being the biggest threat in any room. "Walk away, stranger," the larger one said. "This isn't your business. You hit an old man over a tax dispute. I said walk away." Demon didn't walk away. What happened next was brief and unpleasant, and ended with both guards on the ground and Demon's knuckles split and bleeding against the cobblestones. The old man stared at him with wide, terrified eyes, not grateful, terrified, and then gathered his apples and fled without a word. Demon left the city that night, quickly, before the guards woke up, and before anyone could ask questions about the stranger who fought like he'd been trained by a royal combat master, because he had been. His hand throbbed. His cough was worse. He had no money, no food, and an increasingly clear picture of the kingdom he had been ruling from behind walls of stone and glass. The fifth city was the smallest yet. A village, really. Barely a cluster of houses around a well. Demon arrived at dusk, exhausted, hungry, his cough deep enough now that it hurt to breathe. 3 days of rain had soaked through his cloak, and the autumn wind cut through his clothes like they were made of paper. He knocked on a door. A woman answered. "Please," he said. "I just need water. I've been on the road for water's for residents." She closed the door. He knocked on a second door. A man opened it, looked him up and down and said, "We don't take vagrants." The door closed. A third door. This time, no one answered at all, though he could see a candle burning through the window and hear voices inside. Demon stood in the rain in the center of the village, water streaming down his face, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger. He had passed through anger days ago. Something quieter. Something that felt like grief. These were his people. He had given 7 years of his life to protect them, to keep the borders safe, to hold the kingdom together through wars and famines and political upheaval. And not one of them, not one, would give a stranger a cup of water on a cold night. He walked out of the village and kept walking. The road wound through forest and the trees blocked some of the rain, and he walked until his legs stopped working properly, and the cough was bad enough that he had to stop every few minutes to catch his breath. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't go back. Not yet. Not with this hollow, terrible understanding of what his kingdom really was. The 6th town appeared through the rain like a painting left out in the weather. Edges blurred, colors muted, everything soft and gray and dripping. It was small. 20 houses, maybe 30. A single main street of packed dirt turned to mud. A blacksmith. A baker whose chimney was the only thing producing warmth visible for miles. A well in the center of what generously could be called a square. And at the far end of the street, with light glowing warm and amber through its single window, a small shop. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters slightly crooked. Moss and thorn, herbs and remedies. Demon pushed through the door because it was the last one on the street, and because his body had made the decision for him. His legs carried him forward the way a drowning man's arms carry him toward anything that floats. A bell rang overhead, small, brass, cheerful in a way that felt almost offensive given his current state. The shop was tiny. A single room lined with wooden shelves, and every shelf was packed. Glass jars of dried herbs, bundles of lavender and rosemary hanging from the ceiling beams, clay pots of salve with handwritten labels, bottles of tincture in every shade of amber and green. The air smelled like a garden after rain. Thyme, chamomile, something sweet he couldn't name. A wood-burning stove in the corner filled the space with a dry, gentle heat that hit his frozen skin like a wall. Behind the counter stood a woman. She was not beautiful. That was his first thought, and he would spend a long time afterward being ashamed of it. She was not beautiful in the way Lady Portia was beautiful, or Lady Seraphine, or any of the 43 women who had been paraded before his throne. She was not assembled from carefully selected features designed to catch the light and hold it. She was real. Mid-20s, thin, too thin, the kind of thin that came from skipping meals rather than choosing to. Dark auburn hair pulled back in a messy braid that was losing its battle against gravity, strands falling across her face and neck. Her skin was pale with a scattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks. Her eyes were the color of honey held up to firelight, amber, warm, sharp. She wore a simple dress of faded blue linen with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hands were stained with something green. Herb paste, probably. There was a smudge of it on her jaw where she'd clearly wiped her face without thinking. She looked up from the mortar and pestle she'd been working with, and her eyes moved over him with a quick, efficient assessment. Not the assessment of someone evaluating his worth or his status, but the assessment of a healer cataloging symptoms. Wet, cold, exhausted, coughing, pale beneath the road dirt, swaying slightly on his feet. "Sit down," she said, not a suggestion. His voice came out as a rasp. He cleared his throat. I'm looking for something for a cough, and if you could tell me if there's anywhere in town I could... Sit down. She pointed at a wooden chair near the stove. Her tone was the tone of someone who was not accustomed to being argued with and had no interest in starting now. He sat down. Later, he would realize that it was the first time in 7 years that someone had given him a direct order and he had obeyed without thinking. The king of the realm commanded to sit by a woman with herb paste on her jaw, and he had simply sat. She disappeared through a doorway behind the counter. He heard sounds, a kettle being filled, the clank of metal, a cabinet opening and closing. She returned 2 minutes later carrying a clay mug that steamed and smelled of ginger and honey and something bitter beneath. She set it in front of him. He reached into his pocket automatically, then remembered. Empty. He'd been robbed days ago. He had nothing. "I don't have money," he said. The words tasted like rust. "I was robbed on the road. I can work. If there's anything that needs..." She pushed the mug closer to him. "Drink." "I can't pay you." "Did I ask you to pay me?" He looked at her. She looked back. Her amber eyes were steady, clear, completely unmoved by the fact that a soaking wet stranger had just walked into her shop with nothing to offer. "You're shaking," she said. "You're running a fever. I can see it in your eyes. You've been coughing long enough that your ribs hurt when you breathe. Drink the tea. We'll figure out the rest after you stop looking like you're about to collapse on my floor." He drank the tea. It was possibly the best thing he had ever tasted. Not because it was exceptional tea, but because it was warm, and it was given freely, and the woman who made it had not looked at his clothes, or his empty pockets, or his muddy boots, and decided he was not worth the cost of hot water and herbs. She watched him drink with her arms crossed, leaning against the counter. When he finished, she took the mug, refilled it without being asked, and set it back in front of him. "When did you last eat?" He tried to remember. "Yesterday, I think." There was bread. Something tightened in her expression. Not pity. He'd learned to recognize pity in the last 2 weeks, and this wasn't it. This was something closer to irritation, the focused, practical irritation of someone who considered hunger an engineering problem to be solved rather than a tragedy to be mourned. She went to the back room again, returned with a bowl of soup, simple, vegetable, but thick and hot, and half a loaf of dark bread. "Eat slowly. Your stomach will cramp if you rush it." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." "Eat." He ate, slowly, the way she told him to. The soup was good, better than good, seasoned with herbs that turned simple vegetables into something that tasted like someone gave a damn. The bread was fresh, baked that morning from the softness of it. She sat across from him at the small table near the stove and worked while he ate, grinding herbs with her mortar and pestle, her movements rhythmic and practiced, her eyes occasionally flicking to him with that healer's assessment, checking his color, his breathing, the steadiness of his hands. "What's your name?" she asked, casually, the way you'd ask the weather. "Demon." It came out before he could think of a lie. His real name. Stupid. But she wouldn't know it. Kings didn't have first names outside the capital. To the rest of the kingdom, he was the alphaking, or His Majesty, or the Valdris Wolf. Demon was just a word, just a name. "Demon," she repeated, testing the shape of it. "I'm Irene. Irene Moss." "You have a last name?" she asked. He hesitated for exactly 1 second too long. She noticed. He could see her notice. A slight narrowing of those amber eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't suspicion exactly but was adjacent to it. Awareness. This was a woman who paid attention. "Cross," he said. It was his real surname, but Cross was common enough in the eastern provinces. Half the blacksmiths in the kingdom were named Cross. Demon Cross. She said it like she was filing it away in a cabinet inside her head. Organized, cataloged, retrievable. Where are you coming from? East, traveling west. Toward what? Away from what? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, as though that answer, the most honest thing he had said in weeks, was sufficient. There's a room upstairs, she said. It was my mother's. It's small, but the roof doesn't leak, which is more than most places in this town can promise. You can stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll see how that cough sounds. I told you I can't pay, and I told you I didn't ask. She stood up and began clearing the table with brisk, efficient movements. The back fence has been falling down for 2 months, and I haven't had time to fix it. The woodpile is low. The shutters on the east window don't close properly, and every time it rains, which is constantly, water gets into my storeroom and ruins the dried yarrow. If you're the kind of man who needs to earn his keep to sleep at night, there's plenty to earn it with. She said it without looking at him, matter of fact, as though offering shelter to a stranger was as routine as sweeping the floor. He stared at her back as she carried the bowl to the basin. The firelight caught the loose strands of her hair and turned them copper. Her shoulders were straight but thin beneath the faded blue fabric. She moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing everything alone for a long time and had gotten very good at it, and was very, very tired of it, but would never say so. Thank you, he said. She glanced over her shoulder. Don't thank me yet. The mattress is older than the building. The room was small, a narrow bed with a wool blanket and a pillow that had been restuffed so many times it was more patch than pillow. A window that looked out over the back garden. Even in the rain and the dark, he could see the shapes of herb beds, neat rows of plants he couldn't identify. A candle on a wooden shelf, a small mirror on the wall, cracked in one corner. He sat on the bed and felt the mattress give beneath him, old, as she'd warned, but dry and warm. The room smelled faintly of lavender. Dried bundles of it hung from a nail on the back of the door. His mother's room. She had said that, casually, in passing, in the same tone she used for everything, direct, unadorned, stripped of sentimentality. But the lavender was fresh. Someone was still replacing it. Someone was still keeping this room alive. Demon lay down in the dark and listened to the rain on the roof and the faint sounds of Irene moving below, closing shutters, banking the fire in the stove, the quiet clink of jars being arranged on shelves, the sounds of a life, small, ordinary, lived alone. He fell asleep faster than he had in months. He woke to the smell of bread. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling was low. The light through the window was gray and soft. The bed was narrow, and the blanket smelled like lavender, and he was warm, genuinely warm, for the first time in 2 weeks. Then he coughed, and the previous night reassembled itself. The rain, the shop, the tea. The woman with amber eyes and herb paste on her jaw, who had fed him and housed him without asking a single question that mattered and answered every question that did. He got up. His body ached, the deep, settled ache of too many nights on cold ground. But the cough was better. Whatever she'd put in that tea had worked. He splashed water on his face from a basin she'd left outside the door, pulled on his clothes, and went downstairs. She was already working. Of course she was. The shop was open, the stove was lit, and she was behind the counter measuring dried chamomile into small paper packets, with the focused precision of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and intended to do it 10,000 more. There's bread on the table, she said without looking up. And tea. The cough mixture is in the green bottle by the stove, 2 spoonfuls every 4 hours. Don't skip it, or I'll know. How would you know? Because I'll hear you coughing through the floor tonight, and I will come upstairs, and I will not be pleasant about it. He almost smiled. Almost. The muscles in his face remembered the general concept but couldn't quite commit to the execution. He ate. The bread was fresh. She had baked it that morning, he realized. Before dawn, before the shop opened, she had gotten up and baked bread so that the stranger sleeping in her dead mother's room would have something to eat when he woke. He didn't know what to do with that. He had commanded armies. He had negotiated treaties with men who would have cheerfully murdered him given the opportunity. He had held a kingdom together with his bare hands for 7 years. And a woman baking bread for him at dawn without being asked or expected to had left him completely, utterly without a response. "The fence," he said, because he needed to say something. "You said the back fence." "Post on the left side is rotted through. There's spare lumber in the shed. Tools, too, if they haven't rusted. I haven't checked in a while." She paused in her measuring. "You know how to use a hammer?" "I can figure it out." She gave him a look. The kind of look that said she had serious doubts about this claim, but was willing to let reality confirm them. He fixed the fence. It took most of the morning. The rotted post came out in pieces and the ground was sodden from the rain, which meant digging a new hole in what was essentially cold soup. The spare lumber in the shed was rough cut and needed shaping. The tools had in fact rusted, and he spent the first hour cleaning and sharpening them before he could use them. But the work felt good, physical, honest. The kind of labor that engaged the body and released the mind. He hadn't done anything like this since he was 16, before his father died, before the crown landed on his head like an anvil. Irene checked on him once. She came to the back door, leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, and watched him swing the hammer for about 30 seconds. "You've done this before?" she said. "What makes you say that?" "You hold the hammer like you know what it's for. Most men who say they can fix things hold it like they're trying to kill a spider." "I helped build a barn once." "When I was young." "Where?" "East." "You say east, the way other people say, somewhere I don't want to talk about." He drove the nail in with 2 clean strokes instead of answering. "Fine," she said. "Keep your secrets. Demon Cross from the east. Lunch is in an hour. Don't be late. I don't reheat." Lunch was stew. Thick, hearty, made from root vegetables and herbs from her garden, and a small amount of salted meat that he suspected was a luxury she wouldn't normally spend on herself. They ate at the small table in the back room of the shop, while rain streamed down the window and the stove ticked and settled. She talked while they ate. Not about herself. She deflected personal questions with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years, but about the town, the people, the baker whose wife had just had twins, the blacksmith who drank too much but made the best horseshoes in 3 counties, the old woman at the end of the street who grew roses and swore at anyone who walked too close to her garden. "And the Lord?" Demon asked, casually, the way she had asked his name the night before. Irene's expression changed. Not dramatically. She wasn't a woman given to dramatic shifts. But something closed behind her eyes. A door shutting. A wall going up. "Baron Salter," she said. "He governs this district." "What kind of man is he?" "The kind who believes governing means taking." She said it flatly, without heat, the way she might describe the weather. "He taxes the town at nearly double the legal rate, has for years. Anyone who complains finds their shop inspected for violations. The blacksmith lost his forge for 2 weeks last winter because Salter's men said his chimney was a fire hazard. The chimney was fine. The blacksmith had signed a petition." "A petition for what?" "Fair taxation?" "I wrote it. 14 people signed it. Salter's men visited all 14 within a week." She paused, stirred her stew. "The visits were persuasive." Demon's hand tightened around his spoon. "And you? What happened to you?" She looked at him. Those amber eyes, steady and clear and utterly without self-pity. His son asked me to dinner. I said no. He asked again. I said no again. The third time, he didn't ask. He showed up at my shop at closing time with 2 of his father's guards and suggested that my continued refusal was becoming a problem. She took a bite of bread, chewed, swallowed. I broke his nose with a jar of calendula salve. Demon stared at her. The jar survived, she added. Good clay. Something happened in his chest. A crack. A fissure. Like a wall he'd built so carefully over 7 years had just been struck by something it wasn't designed to withstand. What happened after that? My taxes tripled. I receive an inspection every month. My suppliers in the next town were told that selling to me would be unwise. I grow most of my own herbs now. What I can't grow, I trade for. She shrugged. One shoulder. Minimal movement, maximum information. I manage. That's not managing. That's surviving under siege. She looked at him sharply. Are you always this dramatic? Or is it the fever? I'm serious. What he's doing is illegal. The taxation laws. I know what the taxation laws say. I've read them. I wrote a letter to the regional magistrate 8 months ago with a detailed accounting of every overcharge. Do you know what happened? What? Nothing, because Baron Salter's cousin is the regional magistrate, and the magistrate's wife is sister to the provincial governor, and the provincial governor reports to the king's council, which, she gestured vaguely with her spoon, is presumably very busy with important things like choosing which lord's daughter gets to wear a crown. The stew turned to cement in Demon's stomach. You don't think much of the king, he said carefully. She gave him a look that could have stripped paint. I think the king is a man who sits in a palace 300 miles away and has no idea what happens in his own kingdom. I think he signs laws that never reach the people they're meant to protect. I think he hosts feasts while towns like this one are bled dry by men like Salter who wear his crest and act in his name. She paused. I think power without proximity is just decoration. Every word landed like a hammer strike, clean, precise, devastating. Because she was right. She was completely, entirely, unforgivably right. He had signed tax reform legislation 2 years ago. He had personally reviewed the rates, adjusted the caps, imposed penalties for overcharging. He had believed, genuinely believed, that the law would be enough, that writing the words and stamping them with his seal would make them real in the places that mattered. And here, 300 miles from his throne, a woman was being taxed into the ground by a man wearing his crest. Maybe the king doesn't know, he said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollow. Then that's worse, Irene said, because it means he's not paying attention. And a king who doesn't pay attention is just a man with a very expensive chair. She stood up and began clearing the dishes. Conversation over. Assessment delivered. She had no idea that she had just dismantled 7 years of his self-perception in 4 sentences. Demon sat at the table and stared at his hands, calloused now from the fence work, dirty, real, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Shame. He fixed the shutters that afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the wind was brutal, and the east-facing window of her storeroom was letting in drafts that explained why the dried herbs along that wall were damp and beginning to mold. The hinge was rusted. The frame had warped from years of moisture. It needed replacing, not just repairing. He replaced it. Found wood in the shed, measured it against the window frame, cut it with a saw that desperately needed sharpening, and spent 3 hours building a new shutter from scratch. It wasn't elegant, his carpentry was functional at best, but when he hung it and tested the swing, it closed flush against the frame and stayed closed. Irene inspected it when he was done. She opened it, closed it, opened it again, ran her fingers along the edge where it met the frame. "This is good work," she said. She sounded almost surprised. You don't have to sound so shocked. I've had men offer to fix things before. Usually they make it worse and then expect me to be grateful. I won't expect you to be grateful. Good. Because I wasn't going to be. But something shifted in her expression, a softening, barely perceptible. The woodpile still needs attention if you're staying another day. It wasn't a question, it was permission. I'm staying, he said. He stayed. Day 2 became day 3. Day 3 became day 4. The cough faded under the influence of her twice-daily tea. She made it fresh each time, adjusting the ingredients based on how he sounded that morning, a different balance of ginger and thyme and honey, depending on whether the cough was dry or wet, shallow or deep. She practiced medicine the way a master swordsman practiced combat, with instinct built on a foundation of relentless study. He chopped wood. He repaired the back steps, which had been threatening to collapse for months. He restacked the herb drying racks in the storeroom. He dug a drainage channel along the north side of the building so the rainwater would stop pooling against the foundation. Each morning, he told himself he would leave tomorrow. Each evening, she put a plate of food in front of him and said something that made him forget he had ever intended to go. You argue like someone who's used to winning, she told him on the third night. They were sitting by the stove after dinner, the shop closed, the town dark and quiet outside. She was mending a tear in one of her herb gathering baskets. He was pretending to read a book he'd found on her shelf, a treatise on medicinal botany that was actually fascinating, but he couldn't focus because she was sitting 4 feet away and the firelight was turning her hair to copper and gold, and he was having trouble thinking clearly. I am used to winning, he said. That explains why you're so bad at listening. I'm an excellent listener. You listened to me talk about the drainage problem for 10 minutes, and then did it completely differently than I suggested. Because your suggestion would have directed the water into the herb garden. My suggestion would have directed the water into the overflow bed, which drains into the lower field. He paused, considered. She was right. He had been wrong. He'd been so focused on solving the problem efficiently that he hadn't listened to the person who actually knew the landscape. You're right, he said. She looked up from her basket. What? You're right. About the drainage. I should have listened. She stared at him for a long moment. You say that like it physically hurts you. It does, slightly. And then she laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. Not a polite laugh, not the practiced tinkling sound that noble women produced on command, but a real laugh, sudden, bright, slightly rough at the edges, as though it had been stored away for a long time and had gotten rusty from disuse. It transformed her face completely. The sharpness softened. The guardedness fell away. And for one unguarded second, she was just a woman laughing at a man who had admitted he was wrong, and she was beautiful. Not the way the court women were beautiful. Beautiful, the way a fire was beautiful on a cold night. Warm, alive, essential. Demon felt the crack in his chest widen. Felt something pour through it that he didn't have a name for. Something that felt like falling but in the wrong direction. Not down, but forward, toward her, toward the light in her eyes and the sound of her laugh and the way she existed in the world without pretense or calculation or fear. He looked away, stared at the book in his hands. He was in trouble. On the 4th day, Baron Salter's men came. Demon was on the roof. He'd found a section where the tiles had shifted and rain was getting through when he heard the horses. 3 of them, coming up the main street at a walk that was deliberately slow, the walk of men who wanted to be seen and feared. He flattened himself against the roof and watched. 3 men in dark leather with swords at their hips, the crest on their chests, a silver hawk on a black field, was Baron Salter's. They dismounted in front of Irene's shop with the casual, territorial confidence of men who had done this before. The leader was tall, sharp-featured. A thin scar across his chin that he probably thought made him look dangerous. He pushed open the shop door without knocking. Demon heard voices. Irene's, calm, controlled. The forced evenness of someone managing a situation they'd managed many times before. The man's, louder, harder, with the oily confidence of borrowed authority. Inspection is overdue, Miss Moss. The Baron inspected this shop 3 weeks ago. The next inspection isn't due for... The schedule has changed. The Baron has concerns about unlicensed remedies being sold from this establishment. Every remedy in this shop is documented and within legal guidelines. I have the records. I've shown them to you before. I've shown them to you every month for the past. Perhaps we should check the back room. To be thorough. A pause. Demon could hear it from the roof. The pause where she calculated her options, weighed the cost of resistance against the cost of compliance, and made the same choice she'd been making for years because it was the only choice available to someone with no power and no protection. Fine, she said. Check whatever you want. Demon's hands were gripping the roof tiles hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. Every muscle in his body was coiled. 7 years of combat training screaming at him to drop through the ceiling and end this conversation with his fists. But he couldn't. He was Demon Cross, a traveling stranger who fixed fences. If he intervened, it would make things worse for her after he left. And if he revealed who he wasn't ready. The thought came with a sharp edge of guilt, but it was true. He wasn't ready to stop being the man she talked to over stew. He wasn't ready to become the king she'd dismissed as a man with a very expensive chair. He stayed on the roof and listened to Salter's men ransack her storeroom. He heard jars breaking, heard her voice, steady, so steady, saying, "That was 6 months of dried elderflower. That was my entire winter supply of..." Accidents happen, Miss Moss. They left 20 minutes later. Demon climbed down from the roof and walked around to the front of the shop. Through the window, he could see her inside, standing in the storeroom doorway, looking at the mess. Her hands were at her sides. Her shoulders were straight. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. She was in the place beyond crying where the body simply catalogs the damage and begins calculating how to survive it. He came inside. She heard the bell and turned. Her face was composed, perfectly, rigidly composed, but her eyes were bright with something she was refusing to let fall. "You heard?" she said. Not a question. "I was on the roof." "And you stayed on the roof?" It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. But it cut deeper than any accusation could have. "If I had come down, they would have arrested you, or beaten you, and then come back tomorrow and done the same thing they did today, plus whatever they felt like adding as punishment for your interference." She turned back to the storeroom. "You made the right choice. This is how it works here. This is how it's always worked." She knelt on the floor and began picking up broken glass, carefully, methodically, sorting the pieces, saving what could be saved, discarding what couldn't. Her hands were steady. Demon knelt beside her. "Let me help." "You don't..." "Irene." She stopped, looked at him. He was close enough to see the freckles across her nose, the gold flecks in her amber eyes, the faint scar on her jaw that she'd never explained. "Let me help," he said again, quietly. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. 4, 5. Then she handed him a piece of broken glass and turned back to the floor. They cleaned in silence. It took an hour. 6 jars destroyed. An entire winter's supply of elderflower gone. 3 bottles of tincture shattered. Months of work soaking into the wooden floor. When it was done, Irene sat back on her heels and stared at the empty shelves. "He'll keep going," she said. "Until I leave, or until there's nothing left to break. Those are the options he's giving me." There's a third option. She looked at him, tired, so tired. What? He didn't answer, because the third option was him, the real him, the king who could end Baron Salter's career with a single signed document, the king who could station guards at her door and rewrite the tax code for this entire district and make sure no one ever broke her jars again. But if he told her now, in this moment, on this floor, with glass between them and elderflowers staining the wood, she would never look at him the same way. The man she argued with over drainage ditches would disappear, and in his place would stand a crown, a title, a very expensive chair. Never mind, he said. She gave him a look that said she didn't believe him but was too exhausted to push. They ate dinner in silence that night. The stew was thinner than usual. She'd lost ingredients in the raid and was adjusting without comment. He noticed. He noticed everything about her now. The way she stretched the food to make sure his bowl was full while hers was half empty. The way she added an extra log to the stove in the room where he slept, but kept her own room cold to save wood. The way she gave and gave and gave without ever asking for anything in return, because asking meant depending, and depending meant trusting, and trusting meant losing, and she had already lost enough. After dinner, he said, "Tell me about your mother." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "She was a healer," Irene said finally. "The best in the province. People came from 3 towns over for her remedies. She knew every plant in these mountains, what it did, what it cured, what it killed if you used it wrong." A pause. "She got sick 5 years ago. Something in her lungs. Ironic, for a woman who spent her life curing other people's coughs. You couldn't heal her?" "No." The word was flat, final, like a door she'd closed long ago and bricked over. "I tried everything she taught me, everything in her books. I even wrote to the university in the capital asking for help. Do you know what they wrote back? What? Nothing. They never responded. A healer in a village no one's heard of, asking for help for a patient who couldn't pay. I'm sure the letter went straight into a fire." She stared at the stove, the flames reflected in her eyes, making them look like molten gold. "She died in that room upstairs, the one you're sleeping in. I held her hand and I couldn't do anything." Demon said nothing. There was nothing to say. No words that could fill the space that kind of loss carved out of a person. "That's why you keep the lavender fresh," he said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Surprise, maybe, that he'd noticed, that he'd understood. "She liked lavender," Irene said. "Said it helped her sleep." They sat in silence after that, but it was a different silence than before. Not the silence of 2 strangers sharing a table, but the silence of 2 people who had shown each other something real and were sitting with the weight of it. Day 5, day 6. He ran out of things to repair. The fence was solid. The shutters worked. The roof was sealed. The woodpile was stacked higher than it had been in years. The drainage channel was dug and functioning. He had, in the space of less than a week, fixed every broken thing in her life that could be fixed with a hammer. The things that couldn't be fixed with a hammer, the taxes, the Baron, the loneliness, the grief, those were still there, sitting in the corners like shadows that no amount of carpentry could chase away. They talked more, not just about the town or the Baron or the politics of taxation, about everything. Books, philosophy, whether mercy was weakness or strength, whether a leader's first obligation was to the law or to the people the law was meant to serve. She argued like a barrister, precise, relentless, devastatingly well-read for a woman who ran an herb shop in a village of 30 houses. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked on the 6th evening. They were walking through her garden in the last light of day, and she was naming plants as they passed. This one for fever, This one for infection. This one will stop your heart if you brew it too strong. Don't touch that one. My mother had books, she said. Lots of them. History, philosophy, medicine, law. She believed that knowledge was the only thing no one could take from you. She touched a leaf of something green and fragrant. She was wrong, of course. They burned libraries during the Northern Rebellion. Knowledge is just paper until someone decides it's dangerous. You read the tax codes. I read everything. It's a small town. There's not much else to do when the shop is closed and the Baron hasn't sent anyone to break things recently. You read political theory. I read a treatise on military strategy last month. Just in case. He stopped walking. In case of what? She turned to him. The last of the daylight caught her face. The amber eyes, the freckles, the jaw with the faint scar. She was smiling. Not a big smile. A small private thing that lived mostly in her eyes. In case a stranger showed up and tried to tell me I built my drainage ditch wrong. He laughed. It came out of him like a cough. Sudden, unexpected, almost painful, as though the mechanism had seized from disuse. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. He genuinely could not remember. She stared at him. Was that a laugh? I think so. It sounded like you were in pain. I'm out of practice. Clearly. They stood in her garden as the light faded and the first stars appeared above the mountains, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was going to have to leave. That every day he stayed was another layer of deception. That the longer he waited, the worse the truth would be when it came. And it would come. It always did. Day 7. He told her at breakfast. Not everything. Not the truth. Just that he had to go. She was pouring tea. Her hand didn't pause. Her expression didn't change. She finished pouring, set the kettle down, and sat across from him with her mug between her hands. When? Today. She nodded. Once. The same efficient, cataloging nod she'd given him the first night when he'd said he was running from something. The cough is gone, she said. You're eating properly. You've repaired everything in this building that was capable of being repaired, and several things that weren't. I'd say you're well enough to travel. Irene, don't. She said it quietly, but the word landed like a closed door. Don't make this into something it needs to recover from. You came. You stayed. You're leaving. That's how travelers work. But her hands were tight around the mug, and she wasn't looking at him. I'll come back, he said. People say that. I mean it. She looked up. Those amber eyes, steady, clear, and behind them, so far behind them that you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention, if you hadn't spent a week learning the geography of her face. Something raw, something that looked like the beginning of a wound. Then come back, she said. But don't promise. Promises from travelers are just words that haven't turned into lies yet. He stood up. She stood up. They faced each other across the small table with the stove ticking beside them and the morning light coming gray through the window. He wanted to tell her. The words were right there. I'm the king. I'm the man you think sits in a palace and doesn't pay attention. I'm the very expensive chair. And you were right about all of it. And I'm going to fix it. I'm going to fix all of it. Starting with the Baron who breaks your jars and ending with the system that lets him. But if he told her now, everything they'd built in this small, warm room would collapse. She would see the crown and stop seeing him. She would bow or rage or shut down, and the woman who laughed at his drainage mistakes and told him he argued like someone used to winning, that woman would disappear behind the wall she built for everyone else. He couldn't bear it. So he did something worse. He took her hand. She let him. Her fingers were small in his, calloused, strong, stained with green at the tips. Healer's hands. He held them and looked at her and said nothing because everything he could say was either a lie or a truth that would end this. "Thank you," he said, "for the tea, and the bed. And for telling me I was wrong about the drainage." Something flickered across her face, almost a smile. Almost. "You were very wrong about the drainage. I know. The fence is good though. Thank you. Don't let it go to your head." He squeezed her hand. Let go. Picked up his pack. Lighter now, almost empty, the pack of a man who owned nothing, and walked to the door. The bell rang as he opened it. Small, brass, cheerful. "Demon." He stopped. Didn't turn around. If he turned around, he wouldn't leave. "Eat properly," she said. "And if the cough comes back, it's thyme and ginger. Equal parts. Steeped for 10 minutes. Not 5. 10. 10, he repeated. And honey. Real honey. Not the watered-down garbage they sell at markets. Real honey. Go." He went. He made it to the end of the street before he looked back. She was standing in the doorway of her shop, arms crossed, watching him go. Small and straight and stubborn in her faded blue dress, framed by the hand-painted sign with the slightly crooked letters. She didn't wave. She just stood there. He turned and walked into the gray morning, and the road stretched out ahead of him, and every step away from her felt like pulling a nail out of his own chest. The road back to the capital was 3 days of hard riding. He'd hidden a horse at a farm 10 miles from her town, arranged before his journey, a precaution that now felt like prophecy. Every mile east was a mile away from her, and his body registered the distance the way it registered pain, constantly, unavoidably, with increasing intensity. He arrived at the palace at midnight. The guards at the gate didn't recognize him at first. The rough-spun clothes, the road dirt, the 2 weeks of beard growth. When they did, the scramble of bowing and stammering and fumbling with locks would have been comical if he'd been capable of finding anything funny. Lord Mercer was waiting in the throne room, standing in the exact spot where Demon had left him, as though the man hadn't moved in 2 weeks. The same gray hair, the same thin lips, the same expression of controlled competence masking deep disapproval. "Your Majesty." Baron Salter of the Western District. Demon didn't slow down. He crossed the throne room in long strides, tracking mud across the polished stone floor. "I want his complete financial records, tax collection reports for the past 5 years, every complaint filed against his office, every inspection order he's issued. I want them on my desk by morning." Mercer's composure cracked by approximately 1 millimeter. "May I ask what prompted—" "You may not." "By morning, Mercer." He didn't sleep. He bathed, standing in the copper tub, watching the road dirt turn the water brown, scrubbing his skin until it was raw and still feeling her fingerprints on his hand from that last moment in the shop. He dressed in clothes that felt wrong, too fine, too clean, too much like a costume. He sat at his desk and read reports until dawn. The picture they painted was exactly what Irene had described, and worse. Baron Salter wasn't overtaxing one town. He was running a systematic extraction operation across the entire Western District. 14 villages bled dry, tax rates double and triple the legal cap, inspection fees that didn't exist in any law book, fines for violations invented on the spot, merchants intimidated into silence, petitions intercepted by the regional magistrate, Salter's cousin, just as she'd said. Complaints that never reached the capital because the system designed to carry them upward had been corrupted at every level. And at the bottom of one report, buried in a footnote nearly invisible, a reference to ongoing compliance issues with an unlicensed herbalist in the township of Briar Hill. Unlicensed. Irene Moss, who had studied every law on the books, who documented every remedy she sold, who kept records so meticulous they would shame a royal clerk, labeled unlicensed by a man who had never opened her files because the point was never compliance, The point was control. Demon read every page, every number, every name. Then he called for his guard. 5 days. That was how long it took to assemble the convoy, gather the judiciary panel, prepare the warrants, and ride west. 5 days during which Demon did not sleep more than 3 hours a night and spent every waking moment either reviewing evidence or standing at his window staring west toward a town he couldn't see, and a woman who was probably grinding herbs and thinking he was never coming back. 5 days during which he replayed every conversation, the stew, the drainage argument, the moment she'd laughed and her whole face changed. The morning he'd left and she told him how to make cough tea, thyme and ginger, equal parts, steeped for 10 minutes, not 5, and the way her voice had been steady and her eyes had not. 5 days during which he composed and discarded 100 versions of what he would say to her when he arrived. None of them were good enough. The royal convoy entered Briar Hill on a Tuesday afternoon. 20 riders in silver armor, crimson and gold banners snapping in the autumn wind, a judiciary carriage carrying 3 senior judges from the capital, and behind them, a carriage of black lacquered wood with the king's crest in silver on the door. The town stopped breathing. People emerged from houses, from shops, from the bakery and the smithy and the tiny stone church at the end of the street. They stood in the mud with their mouths open and their hands slack at their sides. Most of them had never seen a royal banner. Several had never seen more than 3 horses at once. The baker was holding a loaf of bread he'd forgotten about. It was burning. He didn't notice. The blacksmith had dropped his hammer on his own foot. He didn't notice that either. Demon stepped out of the carriage. Black coat, silver bands at his wrists, the Valdres crest embroidered in silver thread on his chest, the circlet of hammered silver on his brow, the thin ring of metal worth more than this entire town. He looked like what he was, the alphaking, the most powerful man in the realm, a force that could reshape lives with a word and end them with a nod. He looked nothing like a man who fixed fences. He walked down the main street. His boots, polished black leather, not the cracked traveling pair, struck the packed dirt with the measured cadence of a man who was accustomed to every step being watched and who had never been more terrified in his life. The shop at the end of the street. The hand-painted sign with the slightly crooked letters. Moss and thorn. Herbs and remedies. The window glowing warm with candlelight even in the afternoon, because the building faced north, and she always lit candles early. The door was open. Through it, he could see her behind the counter, wrapping a packet of dried chamomile for an elderly woman. Her dark auburn hair was in its usual braid, losing its usual battle. She was wearing the faded blue dress. There was something green on her jaw again. Herb paste, same spot, because she always wiped her face without thinking when she was concentrating. She heard the commotion, the horses, the gasps, the clanking of 20 sets of armor. She looked up. Through the window, she saw the banners first, crimson and gold, snapping in the wind. Then the riders, silver armor catching the pale autumn light. Then the carriage with the royal crest. Then him, walking toward her. The same walk, the same stride, the same way he held his shoulders, slightly forward, like a man bracing against something invisible. But everything else was different. The clothes, the silver, the circlet, the 20 armed men at his back, the weight of a kingdom in his bearing. Her hands stopped moving. The packet of chamomile sat half-wrapped on the counter. The elderly woman turned, saw the approaching convoy, gasped, and dropped into a curtsy so fast her knees cracked like dry wood. Irene didn't move. He reached the door, stepped inside. The brass bell rang overhead. Small, cheerful, the same bell that had greeted him 2 weeks ago when he'd stumbled in half dead with cold, and she'd told him to sit down. He stood in her shop, the alphaking, in a room that smelled like chamomile and lavender and the particular warmth of a wood-burning stove. Surrounded by jars of dried herbs and bottles of tincture and bundles of rosemary hanging from the ceiling, standing on the same floor where he'd knelt beside her picking up broken glass. She looked at his face, his real face, the same gray eyes, the same jaw that hadn't unclenched in 7 years except for 1 week in her kitchen, the same mouth that had almost smiled when she told him his laugh sounded like pain. "Demon Cross," she said. Her voice was level, controlled, a masterpiece of composure built on a foundation that was cracking. From the east. "Irene, Demon Cross." She said it again, slower, tasting each syllable, finding the poison in it. Who doesn't have a last name anyone would recognize? Who fixes fences? Who argues about taxes like he wrote them? "Please let me." Who eats my food and sleeps in my mother's bed and tells me he's a traveler running away from something? She paused. Her hands were flat on the counter, pressing down, holding herself in place. "The Alpha King. You are the Alpha King." "Yes." The elderly woman on the floor made a sound like a mouse being stepped on. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Demon had ever heard. Louder than battles. Louder than the roar of councils in session. Louder than 7 years of empty rooms and emptier conversations. She looked at him. Not at the crown. Not at the crest. Not at the armored men visible through her window. At him. And he watched it happen. Watched the week reassemble itself behind her amber eyes. Every conversation, every meal, every argument, every truth she'd spoken about the king and his kingdom and his very expensive chair. She had called him a man who didn't pay attention. She had said power without proximity was decoration. She had told him the king signed laws that never reached the people they were meant for. She had said all of this to his face while feeding him soup she couldn't afford, and she had meant every word. And now she knew who had been sitting across the table. "You lied to me," she said. "Every day, every conversation, every time you sat at my table and let me." She stopped, swallowed. Her jaw tightened the way it did when she was containing something too large for the space available. "Get out of my shop. Irene, please. Your Majesty." The title was a weapon. She drove it between them like a blade. "Get out of my shop." He could have stayed. He was the king. The building, the town, the ground beneath her feet, all technically his domain. He could have commanded her to listen, could have used the authority she'd just discovered he carried to force the conversation she refused to have. He left. The bell rang behind him. Small, brass, no longer cheerful. He didn't leave the town. He ordered the pavilion set up at the edge of the village, a royal tent that looked absurd next to the modest houses, like a peacock that had wandered into a chicken coop. His captain of the guard, a solid, unimaginative man named Thorne, kept glancing toward the herb shop with the expression of someone trying to solve a math problem with too many variables. "Your Majesty, how long will we be?" "As long as necessary." "As long as what is necessary, exactly?" Demon didn't answer. He was looking at the shop, the shutters, his shutters, the ones he'd built from scratch, were closed. The candles in the window had been extinguished. She'd shut him out. Completely. The next morning, he walked to her door. Alone. No guards. No crown. He'd left the circlet in the tent because it felt like bringing a weapon to an apology. Just the black coat, because he no longer owned anything else and a man had to wear something. The shop was closed. The sign read, "Closed," in handwriting he recognized. He knocked. Silence. "Irene, I know you're in there." Nothing. "I can hear you grinding herbs. You always grind louder when you're angry." A pause in the grinding. Then it resumed, harder. louder, aggressively. She was pulverizing those herbs into dust. He sat down on her doorstep. The stone was cold. The morning was gray and sharp with the smell of autumn. He sat there for 4 hours, his back against her door, his legs stretched across the step. The most powerful man in the kingdom, sitting in the dirt like a beggar at a gate that wouldn't open. Townspeople walked past, stared, whispered. The baker dropped another loaf. She didn't open the door. He came back the next morning, knocked, spoke to the wood, sat on the step. 4 hours, 5, until the sun moved behind the mountains and the cold settled into his bones. The third day, it rained. He sat in the rain. Captain Thorne brought him a cloak. He sent it back. Thorne brought it again. He sent it back again. Thorne, who had served in 3 wars and feared nothing that bled, looked at his king sitting in the rain outside an herb shop and decided that love was more frightening than combat. On the 4th morning, Demon brought bread from the baker, left it on her doorstep with a note written on a scrap of paper. From the baker, not poisoned, not a metaphor, just bread. D. He came back at noon. The bread was gone. The note was still there. On the back, in her handwriting, sharp, precise, the penmanship of a woman who had opinions about letter formation. The baker's bread is mediocre at best. Try the rolls. He brought rolls the next morning. Gone by noon. New note. Better. Still not forgiven. He brought rolls and a jar of honey the morning after. Real honey. He'd sent a rider to the next town because the local supply was, as she had once warned him, watered-down garbage. Gone. Note. The honey is acceptable. Where did you find it? He wrote back. Sent a man on horseback to Milford. 3-hour ride each way. Her response. You sent a royal soldier on a 6-hour round trip for honey. His response. You said real honey. I listen now. No note the next morning, but the rolls were gone, and when he pressed his ear to the door, quietly, so the gathering crowd of fascinated townspeople wouldn't see the alphaking with his ear against a herbalist's door, he thought he heard something that might have been a laugh, or might have been more aggressive grinding. With Irene, it was hard to tell. On the 6th night, Baron Salter made his move. Demon had known it was coming. From the moment the royal convoy had arrived, Salter's position was untenable. A king, camped on the doorstep of a woman the Baron had been systematically persecuting. Salter couldn't know why Demon was there, but he knew what it looked like. Attention, scrutiny, the beginning of an unraveling. Cornered animals bite. Demon heard them at midnight. 3 men, coming over the back fence. His fence, the one he'd built with lumber from her shed and tools he'd spent an hour derusting. Moving through the garden she'd planted herself, the herbs she grew because Salter had cut off her suppliers, stepping on the chamomile and the thyme and the rosemary she'd been nurturing since her mother died. He heard them because he was there. Every night since his arrival, after the hours on the doorstep and the notes and the rolls and the honey, Demon had walked around the building and settled against the back wall, wrapped in his cloak on the cold ground. Hidden in the shadow where the wall met the fence, staying until dawn. She didn't know. No one knew. Not his guards, not Thorne, not the townspeople who tracked his movements with the dedication of amateur spies. Every night the alphaking disappeared from his pavilion, and every morning he reappeared, and no one could account for the hours between. He spent them on the ground behind her shop, not because he expected an attack, because the thought of sleeping in his warm tent while she slept alone and unprotected in a town where men broke her things for sport, that thought made sleep impossible. He'd tried the first night, lay in the tent staring at the canvas ceiling for 3 hours before his body simply got up and carried him to her wall, the way it had carried him into her shop that first night. Instinct, gravity, the pull of something he couldn't name, and couldn't resist. So when the three shadows came over the fence at midnight, he was already there, already awake, already moving. The first man didn't see him. Demon's fist connected with his jaw, a clean strike, trained, precise, and dropped him in the dirt between the rosemary and the sage. He fell on the chamomile. Irene was going to be furious. The second man spun, hand going to the short blade at his hip. Fast, but not fast enough. Demon caught his wrist, twisted, heard the blade hit the dirt, and drove the man face first into the herb bed with a force that ended the conversation permanently. The third man ran, scrambled back over the fence and disappeared into the dark. Demon let him go. He'd be found by morning. Salter's men all wore the same distinctive boots, the Baron's hawk crest stamped into the leather. Vanity as evidence. He'd remember to thank Salter for that at the tribunal. The back door opened. Irene stood in the doorway, cast iron pan in her right hand, raised to striking height, candle in her left. Her hair was down, the first time he'd seen it loose, falling past her shoulders in dark auburn waves that caught the candlelight and turned to copper and shadow. White linen nightdress, bare feet on cold stone, eyes wide, blazing, absolutely ready to cave in a skull with cookware. She looked at the two men on the ground, then at Demon. His knuckles were bleeding, split across the first two joints of his right hand, dirt on his face, breathing hard. Standing between her and the unconscious men with the automatic positioning of someone whose body knew where it belonged, even when his mind was still catching up. "What?" she started. "Salter's men, coming through the back." She processed this in approximately 2 seconds. Then her gaze moved past him, past the fallen men, past the trampled herbs, to the wall, to the shadow at the base of it, to the cloak on the ground. The impression in the earth where a body had been lying, night after night. "You've been sleeping out here," she said. "Yes. Every night. Yes. It's been below freezing. I've had worse." She lowered the pan. Not all the way. She kept it at waist height, which he respected, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Anger was in there, and shock, and something underneath both that kept trying to surface and being forced back down like a plant she wasn't ready to let bloom. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's minor. Come inside." He stepped over the unconscious men and followed her through the door, into the back room. The stove was banked for the night, but still warm. She lit a second candle, pointed at the chair by the table. He sat. She sat across from him and took his hand, the bleeding one, and turned it in the light. Her fingers were cool against his skin. She examined the knuckles with the focused efficiency of a healer assessing damage, then reached for a cloth, a basin of water, and a jar of salve. Calendula. He recognized the smell. The same salve she'd broken across the Baron's son's nose. She cleaned the cuts in silence. Careful, thorough, her touch firm but not rough. When she applied the salve, it stung, and he flinched, and she gave him a look that said, "Grown men who punch people in the dark don't get to complain about stinging." When she finished wrapping the cloth around his hand, she didn't let go. "Tell me everything," she said. "The truth. All of it. From the beginning. And if you lie to me again, even once, even a small one, even a kind one, I will hit you with this pan and no title in the world will stop me." He believed her. So he told her. Everything. The 43 women with their identical smiles. The council's endless pressure to choose a bride from the correct political catalog. The loneliness that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. Constant, heavy. The loneliness of being surrounded by hundreds of people who saw a crown and nothing else. The night he'd decided, standing alone in the throne room after Lady Portia's curtsy, that he needed to know. Needed to know if there was anyone, anywhere, who would see a man instead of a king. The 5 cities, the barkeeper who charged double, the farmer's son who stole his coins while he slept, the apothecary who sold water as medicine and told him beggars could breathe fresh air for free, the guards who beat an old man over dropped apples while an entire market square looked away, the village that wouldn't share water with a stranger on a cold night. 5 cities, he said, hundreds of people, not one act of basic human decency. And then I walked through your door and you didn't even ask my name before you put a cup of tea in my hands. You looked like you were about to collapse on my floor. It was practical. It was kind. You were kind. To a man who had nothing to offer you. And you have no idea how rare that is. It shouldn't be rare. That's the problem. Yes, that's exactly the problem. And I didn't see it from my throne. I signed tax reforms and thought the words on paper would become reality. I approved medical funding and assumed it reached the people who needed it. I governed by document and never once. He stopped. His jaw worked. You told me power without proximity is decoration. You were right. About all of it. Every word. She was quiet for a long time. Her thumb moved across his bandaged knuckles. A small, absent motion that he wasn't sure she was aware of. So I was a test, she said. Her voice was neutral. The careful neutrality of someone holding something fragile. You were the answer. To what? To whether my kingdom had any goodness left in it. He paused. You were the only one. 6 cities. 2 weeks. You were the only one, Irene. Silence. The candle flickered. Outside, one of Salter's men groaned. You should have told me, she said. I know. That last morning, before you left, when you held my hand in this room, you should have told me then. I know. Why didn't you? He looked at her, the candlelight on her face, the loose hair, the amber eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing without reason. Because you talked to me like I was a person. Nobody has done that in 7 years. And I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would stop. The crack appeared. He saw it. A fracture in the wall she'd held up for 6 days of closed doors and unanswered knocks. Not a collapse. Irene Moss didn't collapse, but a fissure, a single line through stone. You're right, she said quietly. I would have stopped. I would have been careful and polite and measured every word and never told you your laugh sounds like a man in pain. She paused. And that would have been worse. Yes? But you still lied. Yes. And I don't know how to trust a man who lies, even when I understand why he did it. He nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't justify. Sat at her table with his bandaged hand in hers and bore the weight of what he'd done. You said something to me, she continued. The morning you left. I told you not to promise. I said promises from travelers were just words that haven't turned into lies yet. Her thumb stopped moving. You promised anyway. I came back. You came back as someone else. I came back as who I've always been. The clothes changed. I didn't. She pulled her hands from his, stood, walked to the window and looked out at the dark garden where 2 of Salter's men lay unconscious in her trampled herbs. I told the alphaking that he was a man with a very expensive chair, she said, to his face, while feeding him soup I couldn't afford. Best soup I've ever eaten. This isn't funny. I'm not laughing. I'm telling you that you told the king the truth, the only person who has in 7 years. That's not something to be embarrassed about. That's the reason I'm here. She turned from the window. You're here because you decided I'm something that fits into your story about the good king who went among his people and found the one honest soul. But I'm not a character in your story, demon. I'm a woman who runs an herb shop and can't afford to replace the elderflower your baron's men destroyed. He's not my baron. Not anymore. And the elderflower. I don't want you to replace the elderflower. Her voice was sharp now, cutting. I don't want you to fix things. I don't want royal solutions to problems that exist because the royal system is broken. I want... She stopped, pressed her hand to her forehead. I don't know what I want. I haven't had time to figure it out because I've been too busy not opening my door. Take time, as much as you need. And you'll what? Sleep behind my wall until spring? If that's what it takes. She stared at him. He stared back. You're insane, she said. Probably. You are the king of this realm and you've been sleeping in my herb garden. The chamomile is very comfortable. Was, before tonight. Something moved across her face. Not a smile. The ghost of a smile. The faintest architectural sketch of a smile that had not yet been approved for construction. Go deal with the men in my garden, she said. Your guards. If they step on Thieler, just breakfast. And then you're going to tell me exactly what you plan to do about Baron Salter. In detail. Because I've been building a case against that man for 3 years, and if you're going to take him down, you're going to do it properly. You have a case? I have records, dates, names, amounts. Copies of every letter I sent that was never answered. Documentation of every inspection, every threat, every jar they broke. She crossed her arms. Did you think I was just sitting here suffering? I've been preparing. I just never had anyone to present it to. You have someone now. We'll see. She looked at him. Those eyes. Breakfast. Don't be late. I won't. And Demon? Yes? This doesn't mean I've forgiven you. I know. This means I'm willing to keep talking. That's all. That's enough. Go. Your men are bleeding on my oregano. Breakfast was bread and tea and 3 hours of the most comprehensive legal briefing Demon had ever received. Irene spread her records across the small table. Years of documentation, organized chronologically, cross-referenced by type of violation, annotated in her precise handwriting. Tax receipts showing overcharges, inspection reports with fabricated violations, copies of letters sent to the magistrate that were never acknowledged, witness statements from neighbors who had suffered similar treatment, a timeline of escalation that began with her refusal of Salter's son and continued in a clear, documented pattern of retaliation. It was meticulous. It was devastating. And it had been sitting in a drawer in an herb shop for 3 years because the system meant to receive it was controlled by the man it documented. This is enough to remove him from power, Demon said, turning pages. This is enough to imprison him. I know. I wrote it for that purpose. I just never had a court that would hear it. He looked at her across the table. She was eating bread and watching him read with the expression of a woman who had done her work and was waiting for the world to catch up. You built this alone? He said. Who else was going to build it? Most people would have given up. Most people don't have their mother's stubbornness and a working knowledge of tax law. She took a sip of tea. Are you going to do something with it? Or are you going to sit there looking impressed? He did something with it. The tribunal was held 4 days later in the town square. Demon had sent for everything. Judiciary panel from the capital, bypassing the compromised magistrate entirely. Witnesses from all 14 villages in Salter's district. Financial auditors, royal clerks to record every word. Baron Salter arrived in chains, not only for the midnight attack, though the 3 men had confessed within hours because men who wore matching boots for vanity's sake were not the type to endure questioning with fortitude, but because the financial evidence was so overwhelming that the judiciary panel had issued a warrant before they finished the first page. The tribunal lasted 2 days. Demon presided, not from a throne, not from a raised platform, but from a wooden chair in the square, surrounded by the people Salter had been bleeding for years. He wore the black coat and the circlet because this was official. This was the crown doing what the crown was supposed to do, but he sat at ground level, eye to eye with the town. Irene testified on the second day. She didn't want a special position, refused to stand beside the king. took her place in the line of witnesses between the baker and the blacksmith, and waited her turn. When it came, she walked to the front and laid out her case with the same calm, precise, devastating clarity she used for everything, from diagnosing a cough to dismantling a drainage argument. 3 years of evidence presented in 30 minutes without a single wasted word. The tribunal was silent. Salter's appointed advocate stopped objecting after the first 10 minutes because there was nothing to object to. Every claim was documented, every number verified, every accusation backed by evidence that had been sitting in a drawer waiting for a court brave enough to hear it. When she finished, she returned to her place between the baker and the blacksmith and stood with her arms crossed and her chin up and her amber eyes fixed on the baron who had tried to break her for 3 years and failed. Salter was removed from power. His assets were seized. His cousin, the magistrate, was recalled for investigation. The provincial governor was placed under review. 14 villages received immediate tax relief and repayment of overcharges dating back 5 years. When it was over, when the square was clearing and the townspeople were standing in clusters of stunned silence, Irene found Demon by the well. "You did this because of me," she said. "I did this because it needed doing. You're the reason I found out it needed doing. There's a difference. A diplomatic difference. I'm a king. Diplomatic differences are what I do." She looked at him. The afternoon light caught her face. The freckles, the amber eyes, the smudge of something green on her jaw because some things never changed. "The rolls were good this morning," she said. "The baker's improving. Or your standards are dropping. Spending a week eating your soup will do that to a man." She was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of people beginning to talk again. Really talk, the way people talk when a weight has been lifted and they're remembering what their voices sound like without fear in them. "Come to dinner," she said, "tonight. Not as the king, not as the traveler, as whoever you actually are underneath both of those. Who do you want me to be? I don't want you to be anyone. I want you to show me who you already are, without the disguise and without the crown. Whoever is left when you take both off. That man is terrified of you. Good. He should be. I have a pan and excellent aim. I remember. Dinner, 7 o'clock. Don't be late, and don't bring guards. What should I bring? Honey, the good kind, from Milford." He came to dinner, without the crown, without the circlet, without the black coat. She'd told him during the tribunal that it made him look like he was presiding over a funeral, and he'd been unable to unhear it. He wore the rough-spun shirt, the one she'd given him that first week. Her mother's husband's shirt that she'd kept for years in a drawer. She noticed. He saw her notice. The slight pause when she opened the door, the flicker of recognition, the softening around her eyes that she covered immediately with a brisk, "You're 3 minutes early." "I was afraid of the pan." "Smart man, sit." She'd made stew, the same table, the same bowls, the same stove ticking in the corner, the herbs hanging from the ceiling, the shutters he'd built holding firm against the wind. They ate. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full in the way that silence between two people can be full when they've said enough words to build a bridge and are now testing whether it holds weight. "Ask me anything," he said. "Anything you want to know. The truth. All of it." She asked. About his father's death. Sudden. A hunting accident that might not have been an accident when Demon was 21. About the crown landing on his head before the grief had landed in his chest. About learning to rule while still learning to mourn. About the loneliness of a palace where every room was full of people and not one of them saw him. About the 43 women and the particular emptiness of being chosen for what you represent rather than who you are. About the night he'd stood alone in the throne room after the latest rejection and realized he didn't know who he was without the crown, and the terrifying possibility that there was no one underneath it. About walking into her shop and being told to sit down. About obeying. About the shock of being spoken to like a human being by someone who had no reason to be kind and was kind anyway. She listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption, without performance. When he finished, the candles had burned low and the stew was cold and the wind had died outside. "You fix things," she said. "What?" "When you don't know what to feel, you find something broken and you fix it. The fence, the shutters, the roof, the Baron." She paused. "Me. You're not broken." "No, I'm not. But you think I need fixing because that's easier than saying what you actually mean?" He was quiet. She was right. She was always right about the things that mattered. "What do I actually mean?" he asked. "You tell me." He looked at her across the table. The candlelight, the amber eyes, the loose strand of hair she hadn't noticed falling across her face, the hands stained green at the fingertips. The woman who had poured tea for a stranger and changed the course of a kingdom without knowing it, and would probably be irritated if he told her so. "I mean that I've met every important person in this realm," he said. "Lords and ladies and generals and diplomats and women selected specifically for the purpose of being perfect. And not one of them, not one, made me feel like a person. You did. In 5 minutes, with a cup of tea you didn't charge me for. That's gratitude, not love. It started as gratitude. It became something else. When? When you told me I was wrong about the drainage ditch, and I realized I wanted to be wrong about things for the rest of my life, as long as you were the one telling me." She stared at him. The candle flickered. Somewhere outside, an owl called. "That is the most ridiculous thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know. You want to be wrong. I want to be real. You make me real. Everyone else makes me king." She was quiet for a long time. Her finger traced the rim of her bowl, around and around, the same meditative motion she used when grinding herbs, the motion of a mind working through something complex. "I can't be a queen," she said. "I'm not asking you to be." "Then what are you asking?" He reached across the table, slowly, the way you reach towards something wild and valuable and easily startled. His hand settled over hers, rough on rough, callous on callous. "I'm asking for dinner," he said. "Just dinner. And if dinner becomes breakfast, and breakfast becomes a week, and a week becomes something neither of us has a name for yet, then we figure it out. Together. No crowns, no titles. Just this table and your terrible stew. My stew is excellent. Your stew needs salt. My stew is perfectly seasoned, and you have the palate of a man who ate road bread for 2 weeks. I never said the road bread was good. You said it was bread. That's practically an endorsement." He smiled. A real smile. Not the almost smile she'd seen before. A full, actual, unreserved smile that changed his entire face and made him look, for one moment, like the 21-year-old he'd been before the crown erased him. She looked at that smile, and something in her expression shifted. The last wall, the final layer of defense, not crumbling. Irene's walls didn't crumble, but opening. A door she'd built into the stone, a door she was choosing to unlock. She turned her hand over beneath his, palm to palm. Her fingers laced through his, slowly, deliberately, with the full weight of knowing who he was and what it meant and what it would cost. "Dinner," she said. "We start with dinner. Dinner. And you're helping with the dishes. Kings do dishes in this house." "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am." "Yes, Irene." "Better." Dinner became breakfast. Breakfast became a week. The week became a month. The month became the space between two lives learning to fit together. Not seamlessly, not easily, but with the determined, imperfect persistence of two people who had decided that the thing between them was worth the work of building it. He couldn't stay in Briar Hill. She couldn't move to the capital. The compromise took 3 arguments, 2 slammed doors, and 1 memorable incident involving a thrown bread roll before they found it. A house, halfway between the palace and her town. Close enough for him to govern. Close enough for her to keep the shop open 3 days a week. The sign still read, Moss and Thorn. The letters were still crooked. She refused to repaint them. She attended council meetings. Not as queen. She hadn't taken a title and responded to the suggestion with a look that made Lord Mercer take a physical step backward. She attended as advisor, unpaid, unofficial, answering to no one except her own judgment. She read policy proposals the way she read herb recipes, with meticulous attention to detail and 0 tolerance for filler. This tax amendment has 3 loopholes a child could exploit, she told the council on a Tuesday morning, standing at the long table in a green dress with her hair in its usual collapsing braid. Lord Mercer, did anyone actually read this before bringing it to the table? Mercer, who had survived 3 kings and 2 wars, had learned to appreciate her, in the way a sailor appreciates a storm, with respect, wariness, and the understanding that resistance was futile. Demon watched from his chair. Not the black stone throne. He'd had it replaced with something simpler. Wood. Built with his own hands during a week when she was at the shop, and he needed something to do with the feeling in his chest that had no name and no outlet except creation. The court was scandalized. Irene told him it was still too fancy, but at least he could stop pretending his back didn't hurt. She caught his eye across the council chamber, raised one eyebrow, the eyebrow that meant you're staring and everyone can see it. He didn't stop staring. After the session, in the corridor, she fell into step beside him. You undermined Lord Ashmore's position on border tariffs. I corrected his arithmetic. In front of the entire council. His arithmetic was wrong in front of the entire council. I simply made sure everyone else noticed. He's going to be difficult at the next session. He's always difficult. That's not my fault. That's math. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. The corridor was empty. Stone walls, tall windows, afternoon light falling in long rectangles across the floor. You're extraordinary, he said. I'm a woman who can count. The bar is underground. I'm serious. So am I. If basic competence is extraordinary, your kingdom has deeper problems than I thought. She started walking again, then paused, looked back at him over her shoulder. But thank you. You're welcome. Don't let it go to your head. Wouldn't dream of it. Liar. Always. She smiled. Not the ghost of a smile or the blueprint of one. A real smile. The kind that started in her amber eyes and worked its way down to her mouth and made the whole corridor warmer. He caught up to her in 2 strides, took her hand, and they walked the rest of the way together. The king and the herbalist, the crown and the woman who had never wanted it. 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely way possible and were building something real, not on power or politics or the convenient alignment of bloodlines, but on tea and truth and the stubborn, unglamorous, everyday act of showing up. The morning he loved most was every morning. Their bed was in the house between worlds, the one with the garden she'd planted and the kitchen that smelled of thyme, and the shutters he'd built that still closed perfectly because he'd built them for her, and he'd built them to last. She was always awake before him. He'd find her by the window with a book and a cup of tea, her hair loose around her shoulders, the morning light turning the auburn to copper and gold. Always a book, always tea. Some things were constants, and he had learned to love the constants. "You're staring again," she said without looking up. "I'm admiring." "You're staring. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Admiring is silent." He crossed the room, took the book gently from her hands. She protested, the same protest every morning, the protest of a woman who loved her routines and loved even more the man who interrupted them, and pulled her to her feet. His arms went around her, her hands pressed flat against his chest, then curled into the fabric of his shirt. She leaned into him with the quiet, complete trust of a woman who had taken a very long time to decide this was where she belonged and, having decided, was not going anywhere. "I had a dream," he said into her hair. "If it was about tax policy, I have notes." It was about a shop with a crooked sign and a woman who told a king to sit down. She sounds bossy. She was. She is. He kissed her. The way he kissed her every time he kissed her. The way he kissed her every morning. Slowly, carefully. Like a man who had spent 7 years surrounded by people and had never once been known until a woman in a faded blue dress handed him a cup of tea and said, "Drink." She kissed him back the way she did everything. Completely. Without pretense. Outside, the sun was climbing over the mountains. The garden was gold and green. The tea was getting cold on the windowsill. And somewhere in a small town on the edge of the kingdom, a shop with a crooked sign was waiting for Thursday, when she would unlock the door and light the candles and grind herbs and heal people who couldn't always pay and never once be asked to be anything other than exactly what she was. She would go. She always did. Because Irene Moss was not a woman who abandoned the things she'd built. Not her shop. Not her garden. Not the difficult, stubborn, infuriating man who had walked into her life pretending to be nobody and turned out to be the one person who needed her honesty more than her kindness. And Demon Cross, the Alpha King, the man with the expensive chair he'd replaced with a wooden one, the king who had finally learned that power without proximity was decoration, would be there when she came back. On her doorstep, or at her table, or in their bed, with a book he was pretending to read while actually watching her, because watching her was better than any book ever written, or any law ever signed, or any crown ever worn. Because she had taught him the only thing worth knowing, that the measure of a kingdom is not in its laws or its armies or the gold in its treasury. It is in whether a stranger can walk through a door on the worst night of his life and find someone who says, "Sit down and drink this," and doesn't ask for anything in return. And the measure of a king is whether he has the courage to sit down.